pretty soon, federal agents are not just setting up drug arrests so that they can cut the heroin and keep a bunch for themselves and use it to make cases. They actually go into business for themselves, selling heroin and making a lot of money. I first started getting interested in the CIA's involvement in drug trafficking when I did my second book called The Phoenix Program, which is about um, the CIA's program, which started in 1967 in South Vietnam to what they call neutralize the Viet Cong insurgency. Very complicated story. Uh, uh, but in the process of writing this book about CIA operations in South Vietnam, I heard a lot of stories that the CIA was bringing drugs in from Laos and allowing the people that were the CIA was working with in South Vietnam, generals, senior police officials, politicians. Um, the CIA was allowing these people to bring the drugs into South Vietnam and distribute them around South Vietnam as sort of a payoff for following the CIA's policies and getting them to fight the war on America's behalf. But that book wasn't about drug trafficking, so I didn't really get into it at all in that book, The Phoenix Program. But I decided I would write my next book about the CIA's involvement in drug trafficking. And it was pretty easy because I had met CIA officials, CIA officers who knew a lot about it. And one of them was a guy named Tully Akampor, an Italian American. And uh, before Tully was involved with a program that actually morphed into the Phoenix program. He was a advisor to a senior Vietnamese police official who ran all of the sort of anti Viet Cong infrastructure operations in Saigon. He knew everybody and everything. He knew all the secrets, and we remained friends. And he knew that I wanted to write this book about CIA drug trafficking, and um, he agreed to help me. And
Why do you think he helped you?
well, yeah, and the reason he helped me because he liked me, and it was an interesting subject, and uh, he helped me by introducing me to people. Tully was a World War II veteran, and he went into the CIA from the military. He had a military rank as a colonel eventually, but he started working for uh, the CIA during the Korean War. And after the Korean War, he uh, uh, went to Italy on behalf as a CIA officer. And when he was in Rome, he worked with a couple of guys who were at the time were in Rome working for the old Bureau of Narcotics. Uh, Charlie Siragusa was one of them. Siragusa was actually in charge of uh, all the CIA's foreign operations worldwide. And another guy he worked with was his name was Hank Manfredi, and Manfredi was pretty much the principal uh, Bureau of Narcotic agent in Rome from 1959 until 1966. And being Italo-Americans, and Tully was in Italy from 59 to 66. They bonded. They were all from the Bronx. Charlie Siragusa, Tully, this guy Hank Manfredi, and they helped each other out. Of course, you have to understand the politics that were going on inside Italy at the time, but of course, it had a lot to do with the mafia, and the mafia was involved with the Christian Democrats, and the CIA was trying to keep the Soviet Communist Party out of Italy, and so uh, their operations, regular CIA operations. Tully was an advisor to the Carbonari, which was like a state police force, and uh, so he was intimately involved. He would actually, him and this guy Hank Manfredi would just sit down in an office together and trade information. And eventually, Hank Manfredi actually went to work for the CIA and was one of those was a Bureau of Narcotic uses job as a narcotic agent as a cover. He actually was a CIA officer using Narcotic Bureau cover. So him and at some point him and Tully became colleagues. But the CIA was definitely interested in monitoring the mafia, and was definitely interested in its drug trafficking, all the drug trafficking that was going on in Italy. So then in 19 there was a big you must be aware that after World War II, a lot of major mafioso guys were deported back to Italy. Uh, Frank Coppola was a very important one. Lucky Luciano, of course, was his sentence was commuted, and eventually he was sent back to Italy, and he set up his headquarters in Naples. Coppola was in uh, Sicily, and of course they revived the drum trade. And Charlie Siragusa had been sent to, who was a very good friend of Tully's, had been sent to Italy in 1951, basically to monitor these deportees and to establish the connections that they had with a lot of mafia guys who were all the American mafia guys who were on the receiving end of heroin that was being, a lot of it was being diverted from Italian pharmaceutical firms, but of course, a lot of it was just being sent to the United States the old-fashioned way. Um, Opium from Turkey was being refined in underground heroin factories in Italy and in Marseille, and uh, Italian and Corsican smugglers were sending it to their colleagues in New York City and elsewhere around the country. And so Siragusa, who was Tully's good friend, had actually opened up the Bureau of Narcotics office in Rome, and he was his job was keeping track of these people and all their connections around the world. And Tully's other good friend, Hank Manfredi, was actually had as his job uh, keeping track of Lucky Luciano, and that's one of the things that he did. There was a very important uh, meeting in Palermo in 1957, where the uh, mafia in Italy and the mafia in the United States actually arrived at a new agreement for how the heroin trade would be organized and conducted. And Hank Manfredi had that whole Palermo meeting wiretapped and knew everything that everybody was talking about the whole time it was going on. The Bureau of Narcotics was a very effective organization, and they knew everything that the mafia was up to, thanks to guys like Siragusa and Manfredi in Italy. And as a CIA officer who was interested in the same things, and as another Italian American, these guys bonded together, and they were very close. And now
Oh yeah.
at the same time, there was a young uh, Italian American federal narcotic agent who was working in Rome at the time, and his name was Andy Tartaglino, and he was Charlie Siragusa and Hank Manfredi's protege. When Tully was back in Vietnam on his second tour, which is from 1970 to 1972, this guy Andy Tartaglino was a deputy director of the uh, Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. And at that time, a lot of CIA officers were being put out of work because the war in Vietnam was winding down, and they didn't have any place for these guys. And uh, Tully arranged for a number of young CIA officers who were working for him to go to work for Andy Tartaglino at the Bureau of Narcotic and Dangerous Drugs. These CIA officers who were riffed, is what the term was. There was a reduction in forces, RIF, or RIF was going on. Uh, and these young CIA officers had nowhere to go. Through his friendship with Andy Tartaglino, Tully arranged for a bunch of them to go to work for the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. And from approximately 1968, 69 until 73 years went to work for the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs and later the DEA. And I found out about this from Tully while I was doing this book, The Phoenix Program. And I was very curious to know, well, how did the DEA and the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs put these CIA officers to work? Uh, the organization was expanding, and I wanted to know what happened. So Tully arranged for me to interview Andy Tartaglino. Andy Tartaglino had been joined the Bureau of Narcotics in 1950. He had risen to become the deputy director of the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs in 1968. And when the DEA created, he was one of its most senior officers. He knew everything about the Bureau of Narcotics, the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, and the DEA. He had never given an interview before, but because he was lifelong friends with Tully Alcampora, when Tully sent me to him, Andy agreed to do an interview. It was like, uh, once Andy had agreed to do an interview with me, it was like having an entree into the entire organization. And that was a really big, um, that was, the most important connection I made in terms of getting access to all these agents. And I ended up interviewing hundreds of them. And it was all because of this CIA guy, Tully, who'd been friends with all these Italian American narcotic agents. And based on that friendship, Andy Tartaglino agreed to see me. At the same time, uh, Tully was also friends with the first federal narcotic agent who went to work in Saigon, and his name was Fred Dick. Again, Fred Dick was an old-time Bureau of Narcotic agent. He had started working for the Bureau of Narcotics in 1950, just like Andy Tartaglino had. And in 1969, when the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs had just been formed the year before, Fred Dick was assigned as the very first United States federal narcotic agent in Saigon, which was kind of unusual because most of the drugs that were at that point, most of the heroin and drugs that were reaching the United States had been coming out of Southeast Asia. And the fact that the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs only first assigned an agent there in 1969 was pretty much an indication of how they didn't actually want to conduct any narcotic investigations in Saigon, because any kind of narcotic investigation that you conducted in Saigon was immediately going to lead to all the generals and politicians and police and customs officials who were on the CIA payroll. So Fred had a very dangerous job and was a very politically sensitive job. And at the time, Tully was, as I might have mentioned a little earlier, the senior CIA advisor to the top Vietnamese police official in Saigon. And so him and Fred started working together, just like Tully had worked with those Italian American Bureau of Narcotic agents in Italy for 5 or 6 years, 6 or 7 years. In the early and mid 60s, he started working with Fred. And Tully also introduced me to Fred. And I went and visited Fred down in Florida and around 1989 at the end of this work on the Phoenix program book. And Fred, like Andy Tartaglino, also agreed to talk with me. And uh, Fred gave me at that time a directory of the Association of Former Federal Narcotic Agents. They have an organization called AFNA. And he gave me the directory, which had the names and addresses of every federal narcotic agent in it. So at that point, having the introduction, the entrees through Tartaglino and Fred Dick, I was able to start contacting uh, federal narcotic agents all around the world, wherever they lived, all around the United States. And having these two guys behind me, Andy Tartaglino and Fred Dick, was the entree I needed to start talking with them, uh, none of them, very few of them had ever been interviewed before, and they were all very interested in talking about their experiences.
Okay.
And I decided to start at the beginning. Yeah.
Okay.
One of the things that Andy Tartaglino had insisted upon when I initially went to see him, he agreed to tell me um, uh, everything I wanted to know about how the CIA infiltrated the DEA. But he said that he do all the background work first. And he said before he could possibly talk about the DEA, which was created in 1973, um, of which he was the deputy director for administration. Before he would talk to me about how the CIA infiltrated the DEA and the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, I had to go back and start from the beginning. And I had to learn all about the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which started in 1930. And I agreed to do that. And it took me like 10 years to investigate this old Federal Bureau of Narcotics um, as a condition for being able to then interview Tartaglino about the CIA's infiltration of these later organizations. But he said it wouldn't make any sense to me, or anybody else if I didn't have the background. So uh, that's what I started doing, and uh, in the course of this investigation, which took 10 years, I met federal narcotic agents who had worked for the government in the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s. It was a very small organization. At any time, it only had as many as 350 agents around the world. Almost all of them were in the United States. At any one time, the Bureau of Narcotics only had 16 agents overseas. As I may have mentioned, this guy, Charlie Siragusa, opened the Bureau's first overseas office in Rome in 1951. And at that time, there was only 4 federal narcotic agents stationed overseas. Almost all of them were stationed the vast majority were stationed in New York City. That office had about uh, anywhere between 60 to 90 federal narcotic agents. And really, the history of the Bureau of Narcotics very much focuses on what happened in New York City, especially uh, after World War II, up until 1968, when the Bureau of Narcotics was dissolved due to a corruption scandal in which over 30 agents were forced to resign and another 5 were indicted. And the Bureau of Narcotics was reorganized within the Department of Justice as the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. But I spent many years building contacts and getting to know people and interviewing people all around the country from approximately 1990 right up until I finished writing this first book, The Strength of the Wolf, in 2004.
Okay, that's awesome. Briefly, before I ask you, other power interests in the government wanted the FBN dissolved.
When the United States embarked on its war in drugs uh, in the early 1920s, um, uh, those early agents, and there weren't very many of them, uh, were given a task that was very unusual in law enforcement. Uh, the original Bureau of Narcotics was in the Prohibition unit of the IRS, and of course, it was during Prohibition, alcohol prohibition, which was a different, sort of a different kind of uh, context to the war on bootleg alcohol as compared to the war on drugs. Everybody wanted a drink during Prohibition, and there was there was really no moral uh, connotation attached to it. I mean, the evangelical movement and the uh, saw it as a sin, but a lot of politicians, a lot of law enforcement people Most Americans did not see alcohol as something that was bad or negative or morally wrong. But narcotics was a little bit different, and the techniques for making cases on drug addicts was different than it was in arresting people who were had illegal stills or were selling alcohol to speakeasies or anything like that. Political overtones involved with it, but the very nature of making a narcotic case required that narcotic agents create a crime. They actually had to provoke people to make a deal, to make a narcotics deal. It was very unlikely that narcotic agents would just walk out onto the street and find somebody selling drugs to somebody else. I mean, it just doesn't happen that way. Uh, it's a consensual crime. The person who's selling the drugs wants to sell the drugs, and the person who's buying the drugs wants to buy the drugs. So they do it in secret, so nobody can see them doing it. And this required early narcotic agents to well, again, what it's called is create a crime. They actually, through uh, generally speaking, an informant would have to set up a sale, and then they would have to monitor the sale, watch the sale happen, document it, and repeat this scenario 2 or 3 times. The early drug laws were constructed so that narcotic agents had to make 2 buys before they could make a bust to prove intent and to avoid lawyers throwing the case out of court because you're not allowed to entrap people. So, in order to avoid this condition called entrapment, narcotic agents had to create all different kinds of ruses, and in order to get in order to be present when people exchanged narcotics illegally. And this created a whole new uh, um, area of law enforcement, which had never existed before. A lot of countries uh, will not allow policemen to work undercover. They won't allow policemen to perform as provocateurs in order to set people up and arrest them. It's illegal. If policemen do that, the case is thrown out of court. But in the United States, it's legal. And the federal narcotic agents, in going about and learning how set up these drug busts, had to finesse the law. Um, things like the Bill of Rights were obstacles to their job, and they constantly had to finesse the law. J. Edgar Hoover is famous for having said, when the United States, when the Congress first enacted drug laws, and the government was trying to figure out how to go about enforcing these laws, they went to J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI, and he refused to allow FBI agents to get involved in federal drug law enforcement. He said that he knew that his agents would be corrupted if they did so. And for all sorts of reasons, if you set up a drug bust and the person and you give somebody money, an informant money to buy drugs, and the informant tells the people without your knowledge that he's working for the federal government and he's setting up the drug bust, well, maybe they'll sell the informant sugar, and there'll be no heroin to use as evidence. So right away, um, federal narcotic agents found themselves being in a position that they could be manipulated by their informants. They would give informants to set up drug busts instead of having no loyalty to the policemen who were using them. The informants could just as easily work with the drug traffickers and take the money from being ripped off by their own informants. which was not something that happened to, for example, FBI agents. So from the very beginning, federal narcotic agents would always keep a little bit of heroin in their pocket. And they would get this heroin from busts when they would actually bust somebody, and they would get, let's say, an ounce of heroin. In order to protect themselves from being sold what they called turkey at some future date, they would cut a little of the heroin that they had seized, and when they turned it in, they would turn it in at a uh, lower percentage, and so maybe if they bought heroin that was 50% pure, they would cut it and turn it in at 25% pure, and they would keep half for themselves, and that half they could keep in their pocket, a little bit in their pocket, so if an informant ripped them off, they themselves would not get in trouble with their bosses for having lost $10,000. And uh, that begins a whole chain of events in which federal narcotic agents realize that they're in a position where individually they can make a lot of money off the drug trade. They can uh, actually control the drug trade itself. As investigators, they can decide who they want to set up. They can plant drugs on somebody that, because they now have their own little private stash of drugs. They can actually, if they want to get a mafia drug trafficker who's very elusive and they can never catch him on a wiretap selling his minions to uh, buy a pound of heroin from French Connection, um, which is something that's never going to happen, and they're never actually going to be able to record him doing that. They can find out where he lives, and with this little private stash of heroin what they have, they can sneak into his apartment and they can plant it there. And then they can get an informant to say, uh, Vito or John has a stash of heroin at his apartment, and he keeps it at his television, and I know where it is because I've seen him. And then the narcotic agents can go over there and they can bust the guy, and they can make uh, actually uh, construct the whole scenario so that frame people so that there's no defense from what they're doing. And pretty soon the underworld knows that these federal narcotic agents have this power over them. They don't have to actually have evidence, they can create it. And uh, pretty soon, federal narcotic agents are not just setting up drug arrests so that they can cut the heroin and keep a bunch for themselves and use it to make cases. They actually go into business for themselves, selling heroin and making a lot of money. And what happened in New York in the 1950s and the 1960s is that the agents started competing with each other to make cases and also to control this little sort of
Cottage industry.
the trafficking that they were involved with themselves. And in the late 1950s through the early 1960s, the agents, especially in New York, were competing with themselves and they were killing each other's informants. They were setting up each other's informants. There were 5 groups in New York City, and they were in competition. There was, like I said, only 350 guys in the Bureau of Narcotics throughout the world. So getting a promotion was very hard. There were only 14 or 15 management positions that you could get into. Um, uh, so it became a war between the agents themselves. And they were actually bumping off each other's informants. They were ripping off drug traffickers. They were trafficking in drugs themselves. Uh, they were involved in protection rackets. The actual extent of it I talk about in my books. It's a little hard to get in and describe the whole thing right now. But this fellow that Tully Akampora introduced me to by the name of Andy Tartaglino, who later became the deputy director of the DEA, had dedicated himself to exposing the corrupt agents in New York City. And he had was part of an investigation. He became part of the internal security staff which consisted of two people at the Bureau of Narcotics. One of them conducted investigations on the East Coast, and the other conducted investigations on the West Coast. So there was very little investigating of the agents themselves. And Andy dedicated himself to exposing all these corrupt agents. And in the course of doing my research into the Bureau of Narcotics, I came to know who these corrupt agents were, and I went to them. And I told them that I had all the evidence and I knew everything that was going on. But I felt that it was very important to have their side of the story. I made an agreement with them that I would not connect them to any of these informant murders or any of the murders of.
How many roughly informant murders do you think there were?
There were 28 documented informant. There were 28 documented informant murders that Andy Tartaglino was trying to solve. And I talk about a number of them in my book, The Strength of the Wolf, and how this situation arises and how it arises out of the very nature of drug law enforcement itself and this need to make two buys and a bust. And this fatal relationship that narcotic agents have with informants, where the informants start actually running the agents, and the competition between the agents in the office, and the lack of any inspection service to keep track of them, because nobody could make any cases at all if everybody followed the rules. The only way to make cases was to bend the rules. And all this climaxes through the 1960s. And of course, I knew that Andy was who Tully Alcampora had introduced me to, the C.I.A. officer, and that Andy was the sort of like this. He's been described as sort of like a Dominican priest who was this very straight-laced guy and hated corruption and wanted to get all the bad agents, and I should say was thwarted in his efforts because the corrupt agents had a lot of protectors themselves because they were making cases. Anyway, so I went to the three agents who were the three best case-making agents in the Bureau of Narcotics. Three guys who all agreed to talk with me based on this agreement I made with them. And I wouldn't connect them to any of the murders. Frankie Waters, Lenny Schreier, and Frank Selvaggi. And Selvaggi was considered, all three of these guys were considered the best case-making officers in New York City in the 1960s. And they all ended up resigning from the Bureau of Narcotics in the fall of 1967, just a few months before the Bureau of Narcotics itself was disbanded. And because of this huge corruption investigated and moved from the Treasury Department into the Department of Justice in a new organization called the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. And Schreier, Waters, and Selvaggi all talked to me at length. And they all explained to me the situation from their point of view, what it took to make cases on really vicious mafia drug traffickers, on really truly vicious French Corsican drug traffickers, on really truly vicious drug traffickers in Harlem or anywhere around the world, and how if you followed the letter of the law, you weren't going to get anywhere. And in the course of making these cases, they had to actually be tougher, and they had to be more vicious, and they had to be willing to do everything that these really vicious drug traffickers did, and they had to be tougher and better at it than them, and that this is the situation that led to this really awful situation that led to the abolition of an entire branch of the United States government and its reformation. And Andy Tartaglino's corruption investigation has been entirely classified by the United States government.
I bet.
The details of what went on, nobody can know about it.
This day,
There are reports
to this day.
to this day. It's in 1976, 75, a Senate committee that was investigating the entire history of corruption within the Bureau of Narcotics, the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, and the DEA classified all of Tartaglino's investigative reports and put them under lock and seal for 50 years. And they will not become available to the public, if they become available to the public, in 2025.